Welcome back, everybody, to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's course, we continue our preparation for the Linux Foundation Certified System Administrator exam. In our last video, we installed and did the initial configuration for the KVM hypervisor on our KVM or our host operating system. Remembering that KVM as a virtualization platform relies on QEMU and hardware virtualization. So it's not something that we can configure inside of a virtual machine, so we're running on a physical system. And we looked at how we can determine whether we have the support for KVM and QEMU and hardware virtualization on our system. And we also enabled a kernel module that will allow us to set up bridge networking. So now we're going to configure that bridge networking. So the first thing that we want to do is let's go ahead and go over to, let's become user first, or the root user first, and let's go over to our Etsy network directory. And you'll see that we've got a file. Normally you won't have the interfaces.bridge or _bridge, which I previously created in order to save us some time. But if we just cat the interfaces file, you'll see that your basic interfaces file says to go ahead and bring up the interface for loopback and assign internet and loopback to it. Now, what we want to be able to do here is we need to be able to assign or enable bridge networking for our system to work the way that we want it to. So I've created a file called interfaces bridge that will enable us after reboot to see that we have a bridge network adapter available for our use. So let's go ahead and move the interfaces file to interfaces_backup. And we'll copy interfaces_bridged to just interfaces. And now what we have is we have an interfaces file. And this file defines an ETH0 and the bridged address so that we have the ability to go back and forth between our bridged adapter and our normal adapter. So let's go ahead and reboot the system. I'll pause and come back, and then we'll see that we have a bridge network adapter set up. So we'll go ahead and do a sudo reboot, and we'll be right back. Okay, now that we have rebooted our system, let's go ahead and bring our terminal back up. And from our terminal, we ought to be able to do an ifconfig, which will show us that we do indeed now have a VR0 virtualization adapter. And then, of course, we've got our normal Ethernet address. So what we need to do now is let's go ahead and bring up the virtual machine manager, at least to make sure that our virtual machine is, or our virtual host or our hypervisor is ready to accept us adding new virtual machines. Okay, so let's go ahead and clear the screen, and let's make sure that we have our networking set up the way that we want and that the kernel module is indeed loading. So lsmod on grep-vhost like we did in our last video. And now again, if we do the ifconfig, we see our VR0, which is our bridged adapter. And then finally, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and start the virtualization manager. So if we just do a sudo invert manager, and this should bring up the GUI, which tells us what we have running on our system, which right now, we don't have anything running on our system. So let's go ahead and minimize this so that we can take a look at this.
And we click on Create a New Virtual Machine. If we go to Create a New Virtual Machine, we get a new dialog box. It indicates that the connection is going to localhost. And it's saying that localhost, because the virtualization manager can connect to other QEMU or KVM systems, we just happen to be connecting to this particular system, the local host. We could have passed in a virtual machine manager command to connect to a different host, much the same as if you were using VMware ESX plus the web browser. You indicate what you want it to connect to, whether it is the ESXi host itself or whether you happen to be using vSphere, which is in a clustered environment. It wants to know how we want to install our operating system. The local install media is ISO image or CD-ROM, and that's what we'll be actually using. We'll download offline a CentOS 7 ISO image, and that's what we'll install in a subsequent video in our KVM host. It also supports network installs over FTP, NFS, HTTP, etc. Additionally, it supports Pixie Boot, although most of the time you probably are not going to use that. That's more of a BIOS or maintenance booting utility. And then it will allow you to import existing disk images, which we'll go over again in a subsequent video in this section. Down here in the architecture options, it wants to know what architecture that we're going to be virtualizing. In this case, we're going to be emulating an x86 64-bit architecture, which is directly what we happen to have running, so that'll be a direct translation. But if you hit the drop-down box, you'll see that we can do ARM, we can do Alpha, PowerPC, MIPS, Spark, a number of different architectures. And then the firmware that we can emulate for x86 64, for example, is default in UEFI. And if we change to one of the other ones, it might affect the machine type and the firmware that we can implement for them as well. Again, in our case, we're just going to be working directly with the x86 64-bit architecture. We're going to stay away from UEFI, the QEMU, and the KVM implementation of UEFI, especially as it regards to secure keyring insertion, depending upon the keyring signatory, can have issues in various versions of KVM. So we're just going to stick with the default BIOS-like installation so that we have the functionality that we need to install our operating system. If you need to emulate UEFI for some reason, make sure that at the very least you're pulling down the latest version of KVM directly from the website rather than whatever happens to be in the repository. So in our next video, we're going to again use an ISO image, and we'll start the installation process of a virtual machine running CentOS 7 on our version of QEMU KVM, happen to be running on our local host. But for configuring bridge networking and getting our local host hypervisor up and running and available for us to make installations of virtual machines on, that's all there is to it. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.